It is reminiscent of what happened in the past. If you look at internet, people, when AOL came, it was a closed system, and people thought AOL had the first mover advantage and a moat that's hard to build because they could mail out CDs. And people did not anticipate the birth of an open browser, the open source, and the birth of, hypertext on the internet, right? So that revolutionized how internet, without open source, there would not be an internet. And if you look at similar patterns, OpenAI is the modern AOL of the world. There's ample proof in our history to show, and there's ample evidence what happened today, right? Is showing because, necessity is a mother of invention, they say. And funny enough, when policy a decision to restrict access to advanced chipsets to China really, allowed the free market to innovate and come up with mechanisms to reduce their cost because they couldn't get access to faster chips. And that's a classic textbook definition of a free market fundamentally working, right? So this is exactly this is not something surprising to me, at least, right?
Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mind with CoinFund, a podcast that dives deep into the untold narratives of the crypto space. I'm your host, Jake Brukhman. I'm founder and CEO of CoinFund. And today I'm joined by my co-host, CoinFund partner, Evan Feng. Evan, I want to jump into a little banter here about Miami and WAGMI, but I just have to say, I am so excited for this episode because of all the days we could have had Greg and Vincent on, it's the day when DeepSeek has crashed OpenAI, which has crashed NVIDIA, which has crashed the markets, which has crashed crypto. And I couldn't think of better guests to discuss the emergent situation here than these guys. So I want to dive into that. But before we do, just want to mention, it was great to see you in Miami last week. Let's debrief on WAGMI conference for just a few seconds.
Yes. Thanks, Jake. Definitely excited to host our guest today. And that is coming off of our attendance last week at the WAGMI Miami conference. This was one where it was, similar to some of the ones in the past. The notable speakers this time, I think Luca Netz from Pudgy was there, Paulo from Tether, and overall, a mix of kind of consumer-focused founders, both aspiring and established founders, as well as, a solid mix of attendees. I think of the folks that I canvassed, many were local, but quite a few folks, myself included, did fly into town. So overall, Jake, any key takes from either the main conference itself or any satellite events?
I spoke at the conference. I thought it was a great time. It's been a long-standing one, in Miami. I have to say, I love how Miami's been progressing over the last 4 years. Just there's more and more and more crypto people. There's a bigger community. Of course, my favorite part was the CoinFund WAGMI opener happy hour that we ran. We had over 700 people sign up. Michael Saylor came out to our private dinner afterward. It was fantastic. And, if you guys are ever in Miami who are listening, just follow CoinFund_IO on Twitter. I'll watch out for our next Miami happy hour. We have one once a month. So we had a great time, and crypto is stronger than ever.
Don't miss the next one. And who knows who will stop by. So as Jake previewed, today we have a really exciting episode lined up for you all, and we'll take full credit for the timing of the recording. Just to set the table a little bit, in the past few months, crypto and AI have been rapidly converging with the rise of AI agents and their associated tokens. But now, as additional functionality is being explored and integrated at the ground floor of a lot of these projects, it really feels like we're knocking on the door of expanded capabilities, all commensurate with the open values of Web3 as it is intertwining with the further future development of AI. There's a lot to discuss at this intersection. While some claim will never work, it's actually a critical innovation that we think is expanding the access of AI development and even model ownership. So, at CoinFund, as you might have seen with Jake's bio on X, we believe DeAI Summer 2025 is well on its way, maybe even pulling forward into the spring or late winter here. And I think our guests would agree. So please join me in welcoming Akash Network founder Greg Osuri and portfolio company Prime Intellect co-founder Vincent Weisser to the show. Greg, Vincent, thanks so much for joining us today. How's it going?
Great to be here. What a great day to be here, in fact. So very, very excited to talk about how our predictions came to fruition. And if you talk to us like a few years ago, we always were, had deep conviction that open source is going to exceed closed sourcing. The day has come today. So super excited to be here.
Greg and Vincent, can you guys like tell the audience a little bit like what's going on today in the markets?
Yes, also great to be here. So, like similar to Greg, like can echo this like that. I think the consensus and kind of like the reality is catching up in a sense, even with DeepSeek, which came out like I think almost now 2 months ago, like R1 or almost a month ago, and now kind of like I think the broader public and markets are catching up to it, like actually quite late now that also the paper came out and a bunch of also rumors concretely about how much compute they needed, which apparently was much less than the closed source guys like OpenAI that built kind of the frontier models up until now. And I think it like just like for the broader setting, like to Jake's question, I think basically DeepSeek performance on the model side kind of like outpaced now most of the closed source models, including OpenAI. So there was like a lot of discussion on obviously kind of like the implications for kind of like the closed source and open source, but also for compute and chips. And I think like, yeah, a lot to go through that will be interesting. And kind of also for context, like with Prime Intellect, we're kind of like on the one side building like peer-to-peer compute, but also intelligence. So we're not just touching compute, but also models and actually building on models like R1. So yeah, lots to go through.
Absolutely. I mean, look, guys, I think the story forever has been, the GPU rich big tech companies have aggregated all the compute. They're so far ahead. No one will ever catch up. They have that first mover advantage and they've already run away with the product. The game is all over and open source doesn't have a chance. And Greg, to your point, I think what we're seeing today is an open source model is basically like crossing the frontier of the most advanced, AI that's pretty much out there today, right?
I mean, it's not new. I mean, it is reminiscent of what happened in the past. If you look at internet, when AOL came, it was a closed system, and people thought AOL had the first mover advantage and a moat that's hard to build because they could mail out CDs. And people did not anticipate the birth of an open browser, the open source, and the birth of, hypertext on the internet, right? So that revolutionized how internet, without open source, there would not be an internet. And if you look at similar patterns, OpenAI is the modern AOL of the world. In fact, I tweeted about it 2 years ago on this very exact fact that any sufficiently successful technology has to be open source. And there's ample proof in our history to show, and there's ample evidence what happened today, right? Is showing. Because, necessity is a mother of invention, they say. And funny enough, when policy a decision to restrict access to advanced chipsets to China really, allowed the free market to innovate and come up with mechanisms to reduce their costs because they couldn't get access to faster chips. And that's a classic textbook definition of a free market fundamentally working, right? So this is exactly this is not something surprising to me, at least, right? So so the moat is broken. Now the question is, what happens next, right? Like, well, I think if you ask me, is similarly what happened to the internet when the browser came. It's just that a lot more people have access to AI now that weren't unable to have access to $200 a month, or one model from ChatGPT, right? Similar to what AOL did, right? So I'm particularly excited because I think for the first time, it's so clear and so obvious, not for the first time, but so clear and so obvious and so evident that open technologies will exceed closed source technologies, and being closed source is not a moat at all. And communities will overpower companies, and that's very, very evident what happened the last few weeks.
And this is software, right? Like the idea of export controls or being able to contain knowledge within a single organization. Like I think that's being challenged just by like how quickly we see open source AI catching up or even making its own advances, right?
What's valuable maybe to add is like even on almost like how R1 works and how it's kind of different from past modes, which I think makes it actually particularly well suited for like open source and decentralized progress is that we kind of were in this like pre-training paradigm with like even up to GPT-4, where kind of like the literally the first GPT right like was like $20,000, like, and now costs $4 actually to train, like GPT I think 1 or 2 model, and I think that obviously ramped to hundreds of millions. And I think basically Ilya, this like famous talk at NeurIPS, like the OpenAI co-founder and chief scientist formerly, about like pre-training being dead, and kind of that we entered the era of post-training kind of with scaling inference time compute, which is basically what's behind like O1, but also R1. And I think a big realization is that basically that works much better in a distributed fashion, because you don't need the same interconnect as you need for pre-training on the one side, but also you can train those frontier models, like for example R1 now, and improve them with further additional synthetic data, which is in fact something like also we started to do, and we did our first announcement actually on the same day as DeepSeek last week, where we scaled this with math, and we'll do more in the following like weeks and days in this direction, where I think really the possibility now is even to get much better models than even R1 quite cheaply, like not for the billions that were rumored necessary to kind of scale performance, but more like for 6-7 figures, you can already massively improve upon like R1. And I think that's almost like the bigger news, is that the new scaling paradigm is like extremely, like much cheaper to get reasoning, but it's also, you can build much better open source progress, because you don't need to start from scratch, basically pre-training from scratch. So I think it's pretty good news in the sense like for decentralized AI, for decentralized compute and training more broadly. And I think that really means that like there's like big catch up that happened also as we shifted the paradigms from this pre-training paradigm to this kind of like paradigm that no one like knew was gonna around the corner basically half a year ago even. So I think that's also kind of like underappreciated about kind of this moment like for decentralized AI.
Yeah, because so far the big notion was data was a limiting factor. Essentially, you couldn't get more data because you're running out of data. But with synthetic data, that is completely different, right? So it's fascinating with R1. There are two models. One is a reasoning model that generates the synthetic data and that trains the actual model, right? So, I mean, yeah, like Vincent was saying, this was supposed to be a far off thing of half a year ago. The fact that they're able to achieve this so quickly, and it's not new. I mean, it's also very analogous to how you would train. How would you do protein folding, for example? I mean, you do a lot of the deep science has synthetic data. In fact, even self-driving vehicles are now using synthetic data for training instead of real-world data, right? Because you can actually generate a lot more complex scenarios by synthetic data versus trying to get the same scenarios in a real-life data, right? So I think this paradigm shift is a game changer for training, and I think it's accelerated our AGI timeline significantly, because now we broke the data challenge.
Well, there's a few directions we can take this. Let me just start with like the more basic one. If you're kind of saying that like what is being demonstrated with DeepSeek is that pre-training is not really the moat for big tech anymore, what is the moat for AI then?
GPT wrappers.
Yeah, I think like actually in this direction, I think people quickly realizing that basically like the app layer might be where like a lot of the value will be unlocked. And I think that basically the models like, and which I think is great use for humanity, are more of a commodity than like monopoly mode, basically that ultimately I think a lot of the people I talk to agree with this like long ago. And it was also kind of like our thesis that basically like the frontier model labs don't have a huge moat, like and there was like also famous like blog posts about this, and it's really I think a mix of like distribution, like unlocking the different use cases. But I think more and more what we'll see this year, right, is like as we move from chatbots to reasoners and now are moving to agents this year, like I think there will be basically a lot of challenge almost like in deploying this to extremely valuable use cases, right? Like one example being if you can autonomously run like a startup, like there's basically a bunch of like work that I think needs to be done beyond just the model. But I think there's different layers to this where I think there's also like a lot of the value will go to the compute layer. Like, and ultimately, if the intelligence layer commoditizes, right, then ultimately the margin on top of the compute is not that high. And then ultimately it really comes down to the most efficient peer-to-peer compute layer, which is obviously something like both Greg and we with Parameter like are kind of like building, and in fact actually leveraging also like Akash and amazing work from Greg and his team. And I think that's really where like a lot of the value will accrue and already has accrued, right? It's like that's the reason why Nvidia is worth kind of like what it's worth, and same for like other like compute and chip providers, and also all of the big announcements, right? They're like purely announcements for compute expenditure that those AGI companies, I think, in fact, still need to do, because inferencing those models, running those agents, like as the world kind of like turns extremely intelligent, and we like deploy every AI everywhere, right? Like we'll need much more compute, and I think that's actually a big news in terms that I think the market is also misinterpreting, right? Like as in fact, like almost like displayed by compute crashing for a moment. That actually will like, it's almost like a Gemini's paradox of sorts, where like if the cost drops of intelligence, we'll want more of it, not less of it, which I think will drive actually more compute expenditure. In fact, like Satya Nadella, like the Microsoft CEO, was tweeting this yesterday, that like
the whole timeline, appears there's a lot of Jevons paradox kind of summaries and takes on it. But I think one thing that's kind of interesting too is now that we're compute kind of being the constraint, it really ultimately boils down, from physics to this energy as a bottleneck, which is, I think, an idea, Greg, that you've really thought about, and certainly Akash is, well prepared for. So could you share a little bit more about maybe how the latest developments inform the progression of this thesis around how energy does bottleneck, AI, but then the development then pushes further to perhaps decentralized networks?
Yeah. So, I mean, at least until yesterday, the understanding was the amount of compute we need as the models get more advanced is growing at half an order of magnitude every year. Right? So right now, the biggest data center is the XAI data center in Memphis, about 50 megawatt capacity. The next one is supposed to be 250, and the next one is 1.25 gigawatt capacity, right? In 2 or 3 years, at least, that was the understanding. Now, things have changed quite a lot in like last 1 week after DeepSeek, but I do feel like there is always a ceiling as to how much capacity in terms of energy we need. And in US, the only place to get a gigawatt capacity is a nuclear data center, nuclear reactor, in fact, right? So, and there are about 96 nuclear reactors in America, out of which 93% are used 100% of the time, right? So fully. And it takes about the last nuclear reactor we built was in Georgia, took about 14 years and $34 billion. So it's very hard to get a data center with over 10 megawatt capacity in the US. There are only 1,000, places, data centers with 10 megawatt capacity in the US, right? So what that means is if you're deploying H100s, which take about 1.2 kilowatt, capacity, you're limited to max 8,000 H100s or maybe 10,000 H100s per data center. And that's not training grade, right? So you can't train on 10,000 H100s. You need at least 50,000 or 100,000 H100s. That's the understanding. So our thesis was like, well, the biggest bottleneck today is not, chips are, however, is hard to get, but not chips alone, but it's really getting a data center that can support large quantities of chips, right? So, and we're going to cap out in a couple of years. And that's one of the reasons why I think people are not understanding the impact of distributed training, because distributed training is distributing the grid. Even if you do have large capacity, producing like a nuclear data center, we don't have good infrastructure for transmission of energy, right? So the fact that you need to have several things come together. If you're going solar, you need to have water, because water used to store energy and whatnot. You need to have solar power. You need to have a whole lot of things, whole lot of combinations coming together, and water for cooling the data center, right? So there's a lot of resources that are required to build large scale data centers, which are not the easiest or the fastest things to build. So you look at what technologies can enable model training advancement, and if you look around, only decentralization. As a matter of fact, distribution of distributed training is the only way out, right? So that's why I'm like, in 2 years, I think we're going to cap out as to how much you can do in a single data center. And also, US never actually needed more capacity in the last 10 years. We've been consistently in 4.5 terawatt capacity. And now we have other devices that need energy, like electric vehicles and a whole lot of highly energy intensive applications coming online. So energy is going to be a huge challenge, and we are not as fast as China to build out nuclear reactors. They can do it so in 3 years, right? So I feel like we have a good 5-year shot for decentralization to take mainstream. And if you think about inference, right? So if you think, inference can potentially run anywhere. So running inference in a distributed grid manner is the best way to run, because we have power that's generated locally. We have distributed solar panels. Like my new house I'm building, I have 60 kilowatt solar panel capacity, right? So, and 100 kilowatt battery. So I have capacity. I'm building a little data center in the house that can house 32 H100s easily, right? And with a good enough internet, Starlink now, can provide pretty decent, speeds, and I can get up to a gigabyte transfer capacity. I can host a whole lot of inferences, and I'm most certainly going to host my local AI, because I want AI to do a lot more things than is possible right now. For example, I want agents to record every conversation, everything that happens in the house, and have a lot more plans to do that with that. But I don't want that information to leave my home because of privacy, right? So I believe that as AI gets more advanced and AI gets more usable, people want privacy. People will want to host AIs in the home. That's how we tap into more distributed grid. That distributed grid will power a decentralized AI, and that's our thesis. Energy bottleneck and the need for privacy are going to be key drivers for decentralization when it comes to compute power.
Totally agreed. I think there's ultimately a lot of the limits we're running into, right? Are quite natural limits, right? Of to your point, how fast we can build out the infrastructure. And in fact, I had, for example, wave energy startups reach out to me, which want to put literally compute in the ocean and with an order of magnitude cheaper energy. And I think those things are starting to, become actually more relevant over time, where ultimately there's always some cheap energy somewhere, right? Sometimes due to geological reasons, and that really enables this.
We have cheap energy, we just don't have transmission. Yeah. And it's very hard to build transmission lines in the US because it gets into private property. And try, confiscating people's property in the US, right? So West in general has strong property rights, so it's very, very hard to build transmission infrastructure in the West. So you can have the cheapest energy is wind energy. You can get for under a cent per kilowatt hour, right? And that's really good. That's industrially grade cheap. But the problem is, where do you put the data center near a wind power, right? There used to be a time in America where we had too cheap to meter. We wanted to get energy sub, 1 cent kilowatt hour. With that, we can solve water problems. We can do desalination. We can solve a lot of problems that we have. But for some reason, I don't want to get into politics, but some reason we haven't quite figured out how to build more energy. But situation is, we are here, and we're not going to build as fast as we want to go.
To your point, I think what I'm starting to see is just basically more data centers, even from the very big guys, being built out close to where the energy is, right? Close to where they can get the energy. And in fact, I think what is also underappreciated, in the sense that even what OpenAI announced is it's kind of distributed training, because to your point, they tap out their capacity at I think the 1.8 gigawatt, even long term. It will be hard to go beyond that from the energy they can draw. So they already plan to train distributed across dozens of different data centers, across the whole US, basically. So I think that's the other thing that, Jake, I know you also tweeted a bunch about, is that ultimately I think distributed training is actually the Overton window shifting, that more and more people do realize, especially the people that are deep in the research. That's already happening. It's happening obviously in the open source and decentralized world, also in a more radical way, because the closed big guys, they obviously still interconnect those data centers. So basically they have a different setup, right? Then training over the internet, training across literally the whole world, what we did kind of across Europe, Asia, and the US as an example.
I would say one of my insights is that actually, if you look at the technical problem set that you would need to solve for decentralized training, this looks like things how do you create a sharded model? How do you get that neural network training process to converge across different data centers? How do you get more onto commodity compute? How do you get fault tolerance in your network? These are all problems that are actually like really, really relevant to AI broadly, just not the focus of most people who are kind of like on the frontier, trying to get to AGI, trying to train the largest model, the most intelligent model, the most optimized model, whatever it is. But what you're seeing kind of today with DeepSeek is that, yeah, like this thing was trained with H800s. That's not the highest end GPU. It's not commodity hardware just yet, but it's going downstream toward commodity hardware. And so
Yep.
it's defining this trend where we're going to be able to, do that. Greg, I think you probably realize running Akash that there's going to be some possibility of training on commodity hardware. I know a bunch of our portfolio companies, including you guys, Vincent and Pluralis and Jensen, are all thinking about this. And how does it differ from what OpenAI actually does, or DeepSeek for that matter, when they train the models that they train?
Yes. So maybe the easiest explainer for people is that like centralized training is usually in like one data center, highly interconnected training, which is now also starting to change. But like let's just use this as a simple definition. And then usually in the decentralized training setting, what we're talking about, which is maybe on the complete other end of the spectrum, is like training across the world, like literally across continents in like dozens of different data centers, potentially hundreds of different data centers and sources over the internet, actually. And I think basically what I think is now happening is there's also stuff happening in between. Like instead of basically having fully interconnected like chips within one data center, what the OpenAIs are now doing, they have multiple data centers, right, and fully interconnecting them. That's still like basically the bandwidth between those data centers is very high. And in our setup, and I think that's maybe helps to illustrate the challenge, the bandwidth is basically the bandwidth of the internet you get, right? And the internet you get can range from like maybe 50 megabytes to maybe, if you're lucky, 1 gigabyte, but like usually it's more in the 50 to 100 megabyte range. And then the interconnect like within those chips is in the terabytes per second. So it's like it can be extremely fast. And ultimately, like the bandwidth requirements is really the challenge. And how we got around this is like basically leveraging like early research from DeepMind that we kind of like advance on and kind of build a whole training framework around, is like on basically low communication training. So basically not communicating like every training step, which is very frequently like can be like more than once a minute. And then you spend way too much time communicating if you do it over the internet, because you need to communicate basically the whole gradients, like the whole model across the internet, which then can quickly also take a minute. So basically your compute might only be used half of the time because you're commuting the other half of the time. So instead of doing it this way, we basically communicate much less frequently, like only, for example, every 100 to every 500 training steps. And that really basically allows you then to not have to communicate all your like gradients and your model basically every minute, but maybe only every like 40 to 50 minutes, which is what we did basically in our setup. And that really like enables you to basically utilize the compute much more like time, like relatively. So it's not sitting idle while it's communicating. And that's one piece. But I think also to the one you mentioned earlier, Greg and Jake, it's like that really like fault tolerance and kind of like training across like heterogeneous compute. Like that's the other challenge. And like especially on fault tolerance, we made big progress. And actually, it's like one of the big priorities of like also everyone else, because ultimately what it means to explain, and why it's also even more relevant in a decentralized setting, is if you train on 1,000 chips and one of them fails, without fault tolerance, your whole training run fails. With fault tolerance, it doesn't affect your whole training run. So you can continue training, you remove the faulty node and you add a new one. And that's what we basically did for our run. And in fact, we know from like, for example, PyTorch and Llama team reach out to us afterwards because it's one of the biggest challenges they are trying to solve. And they're quite interested in how we solved it. And I think it shows you that basically, even on things like fault tolerance, like and a lot of those challenges, they kind of shared across the industry. But again, like open source is kind of, I think, like in the lead, because like they don't need to do it like behind closed doors, each on their own, like the closed labs have to do it, but they can like contribute it back to something like PyTorch, to like open source training frameworks that then like everyone in the world leverages. So there actually was like a huge accelerant fast is basically having the open source community to collaborate on kind of like those training frameworks, those communication libraries. But yeah, like I think there's a bunch of other challenges that we're now basically tackling, including like the communication libraries, making those more efficient. But I think really like on the high level, the interesting thing is, I think, as I mentioned earlier, switching to this paradigm like R1 switches us to a paradigm where actually there's by design like less communication requirements. So basically, it's extremely useful paradigm to actually do in a decentralized fashion. So I think that maybe gives a hint also at what we're like doing for the future.
I think what you're saying is inference time compute, because it's easier to sort of like scale with GPUs, right? It's actually like easier for decentralized approaches to compete in that strategy. Am I understanding you correctly?
Exactly. So basically, because you can just like split up the inference workloads, generate synthetic data, right? Like on like consumer devices, on AMD, on H100s, on H200s, and then you basically bring it back and like improve your like R2, R3 basically like with those data. And I think the other piece, like to Greg's earlier point, I think there was this pity comment by like someone from OpenAI being like, oh, but you do know if you use free DeepSeek, you give your data away. And then like the viral comments, right, was like, yeah, what about using OpenAI, right? It's like they also train on your data. And I think more and more people are starting to value privacy, but also they value uncensored models, not censored by like Chinese model developers, but also not censored by closed source American model developers. So I actually think like there's a big still gap like now needed in the next few like weeks and months for actually truly open and truly like also more uncensored models to be out there, because ultimately neither like the OpenAI model or nor DeepSeek is very privacy oriented if you just use it within their clouds, but also like both are censored in like different ways, right? So I think it's actually also a key piece that I think more and more users will demand. And then obviously a lot of the like computers shifting to serve those models. So DeepSeek, interestingly, right, like it went viral and immediately it stopped working, right, because they didn't have enough GPUs to serve it actually. So now people are looking, right? It's like, where can they serve it? Maybe there's some decentralized compute they could use to use the model, or maybe they can make it run at home. And I think, like that's, I think the next shift that will happen.
And also that brings to another very interesting point, right? So right now, models is garbage in, garbage out, right? Whatever you feed it is going to feed out. So there's no way to validate that the model is not manipulating you, right? If these products are so deeply integrated into your workflows, what are the chances the model is slowly manipulating you without even you realizing? So that depends on the quality of the input data. I think that's where synthetic data becomes a lot more important, and transparency in that synthetic data, because that can be validated somehow on chain, right? There are techniques that we can employ today to verify the training data that's going into training these models. So I think there's another big case to me to be made for decentralized AI. When you have full transparency, you have, proof of, sensitive resistant or proof of non-corruption in some form. When you have the entire data that's synthetically generated, because you don't have copyright like issues to deal with too, right? So I'm more and more, since I've been reading this R1 paper, I was just so fascinated that synthetic data is coming to life. I think, people don't understand the impact it's going to have in so many of the challenges we have as decentralized, machine learning or AI, projects where data generation, data collection, corruption-proof data to distribution and actually distributed training and inference as well. So, I think more and more you think about it, this is just the best thing that happened for decentralized AI. And centralized AI is so far behind, in trying to catch up to open source AI now.
Yeah, I think that like it's almost like a structural disadvantage, right? It's like there's a reason why they started out as OpenAI, and then ultimately I think they took the wrong turn. Right? It's like I think like ultimately structurally, I think even though they might like have some tricks in the head, to pull some new models out, structurally they'll never be fully aligned with the user. They'll never be open source. They'll never get the benefits from open source. But I think like ultimately there will always be like similar to open source like internet, right? And like early software, I think there's just like structural advantages that are like hard to overcome for the closed incumbents.
Definitely. And I think eventually users will, over time, continue to demonstrate stronger preferences for the open source models. I think even now, the fact that a lot of people make jokes about, as a shortcut, you can ask politically sensitive questions to centralized model front ends or closed source models just to see how much they're not allowed to tell you as a proxy for how open they really are. That, obviously underscores the progression towards decentralized AI, similar to what you guys are working on, or even companies like Venice, et cetera. So I think it's great to see that already happening, but I think our expectation, or at least mine, is that picks up steam, especially as people realize, as Vincent, I think you were saying, the deeper integration into everybody's work streams, no matter across what industries you work, over time is really going to make it super critical that your decisions are verifiably your own, or the advice that you get from these models can ultimately be traced back to, the influences that you are underwriting to influencing you, if that makes sense.
Well, I was going to switch gears maybe a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of the Web3 DAI space. I know Greg and I, as Evan mentioned, we both have DAI Summer in our X profile. So Greg, what's DAI Summer? What is that all about?
So I think it comes down to ICML in June, the conference. We already saw, at the Neural Labs that happened, which is considered to be the largest AI conference, we were there. I mean, us and BitTensor were the only companies that were represented. I mean, we had News Research and a bunch of others, but I think from a major representation is just Akash and BitTensor on the floor, amongst the big giants. And we're starting to see the conversations were surprisingly not surprisingly, maybe unsurprisingly, not too much about decentralization. But I think a lot of the technologies are getting, more advanced now. I mean, we saw with what, Prime Intellect has clearly proven decentralized trading is a reality. Jensen, as a matter of fact, is going to come up with something that's usable. And in the next ICML, which is coming in June, I think there's going to be a significantly bigger representation, along with an incredible, development we are seeing with agents in crypto. We're able to attract real AI talent now to crypto because now we can clearly show that there's money to be made, and AI funding has dried down quite a lot. So we're seeing a lot more talent coming and embracing decentralization than it was last year, right? So I have friends from, this company called Octane AI, I mean, Matt and Ben Parr, who've been in AI for like 10 years. These are the oldest people I know in AI, right? They're now doing a yes, no error, which is like a new thing. I mean, I'm not endorsing the protocol or whatnot, but just to give you an example of the kind of talent that's shifting over. It's very obvious. Look at the neural apps. People are hungry. People are looking for ways to launch their stuff. So I think there's going to be a lot of new launches in the next few months. With DeepSeek, it clearly proved that open source AI is going to overtake, and DeepSeek is going to even accelerate decentralization, right? A lot of the problems that we had are actually solved with DeepSeek. So I might think the summer is actually accelerated, maybe late winter or early spring, right? So that's what I think. Like with ICML coming up, there's going to be a lot more representation, and we are going full throttle. There are a lot of people that I know are going full throttle, and I think the real DAI Summer, when all these primitives are going to be real, and people are going to be building on top of these primitives. Now, I can't tell you for sure what kind of applications, because that's the nature of the beast. It's just innovation beyond imagination. But I do know when we have strong primitives that are solved for, people get extremely creative. I think we're going to see what happened with DeFi in 2019. That kind of people, we never saw Uniswap coming with a simple interface. There'll be something like a Uniswap for AI. I mean, not talking swapping tokens, but agents seem to be extremely promising. And with DeepSeek, the reasoning power behind DeepSeek, agents are going to get even better. Our decentralized compute is obviously there. I mean, now agents have a decentralized computing home where you have full self-custody, and for sure that agent is an agent because it is running on a decentralized cloud. So we have a lot of these primitives that are ready to take off. And I think DeepSeek is a huge catalyst for DAI Summer.
I'll add one more thing to your DAI Summer view, which is that, for most people, if they want financial exposure to the most frontier AI technology, it would be pretty hard for them to get into the private rounds of OpenAI and Anthropic and Perplexity. And in any case, those rounds are already very advanced. There's not a ton of stocks on the public markets. I mean, sure, there are AI stocks and there's Google, but there's not any stocks that are giving you direct exposure to that frontier technology that's developing so fast before our eyes. And so what I'm trying to say is most people, if they want exposure to AI the way that it is on the cutting edge, they have to buy crypto.
I'm glad I did not get exposure to OpenAI, but listen to some story.
But yeah, I think that's super bullish for basically AI tokens.
Yeah, and also I think the shared ownership model is going to be a very critical aspect, right? So it's not only getting exposure, but also owning. I mean, I guess exposure is kind of owning, but also owning something that you use, right? I'm extremely bullish on some of your portfolio companies like Billy Bagel and a bunch of others are working on this monetization where you have closed weights and open models. I mean, if you think about why I would contribute compute, even $5 million is not a small amount. It's still some amount. As the models get larger and larger, it's going to be much bigger amount, right? So having to own a piece of OpenAI, actual training, actual model and getting royalties when people use, I think is going to be a big shared ownership model the world has never seen before. So I'm really excited for all these new experiments to go on chain and for people to be able to own this part of the revolution.
By the way, Greg, I love that you said that. I think most people don't realize that closed weights and open models is more open than open weights and closed models, which is what we have today. But what do you think, Vincent?
Yes. I think one jump that we'll see, right, is in this info on-chain, kind of decentralized AI, is as we make the progress, right, it's now towards agents and then also towards almost at some point, really strong agents. And I think it's almost initially some weaker agents that we're seeing now, right? But I think we'll ultimately see the jump towards fully autonomous agents that can actually do that are basically hard to compete with, right? It will be hard as a developer to compete with a super intelligent AI developer that costs 10 cents of inference. But I think the thing you can do, right, is own the underlying infrastructure that provides the compute that creates the economic value, and then have a stake in the agents, right? That can actually work around the clock very hard for you at super intelligent levels. So I think actually decentralized AI, I think it's possible with almost the jump to general intelligence and super intelligence, that we need basically a new economics system, right? In which people can participate from day one in the value creation that AGI and super intelligence will create. And I think that's really almost the more extreme case for decentralized super intelligence, maybe, is that really I think there will be so much basically autonomous agents, right? Creating different sorts of value that is hard honestly to foresee. Right? It's you can envision an autonomous agent creating protocols and one protocol per second for 5 cents of inference, right? And sure enough, it will run probably it will discover and create some protocols that are worth more than the 5 cents of inference it costs to create the protocol, right? And I think it's just an example where I think it's crazy, I think, to foresee almost on how wild super intelligence might get, but then also how wild it might get in the on-chain setting where I think machines want to probably communicate extremely fast, peer-to-peer, in a permissionless, trustless way. They don't have a social security number and they don't want to wait on weekends for the markets to reopen. So I think it's quite obvious to me that they'll embrace blockchains, and ultimately that a big part, I think, of the value creation and maybe even the app layer and other things will reshape around decentralized AGI.
And also, I might make another prediction that with the advancements of DeepSeek and whatnot, I think market is going to realize funding private companies billions of dollars is not the way to build AGI, versus having a shared ownership model that taps into global liquidity, that crypto has the power to do so. Leveraging open source model is a much better model, significantly lower risk. It's significantly better distributed and better performant. And I have a strong feeling that now with DeepSeek, AGI is actually possible on chain versus in a private setting. And with synthetic data, the sky's the limit. Only limit is really computing and not co-located computing. Right? You can generate synthetic data. I mean, you need a full stack essentially, but you can generate synthetic data in a fairly distributed manner, like you guys are doing it with the new experiment you're running, right? And that is a big realization. And that is going to put a dent in NVIDIA's networking first, sort of like model.
I have a fun follow-up question for everyone here, which is, what is the role that you think government ideally should play, if any, in helping to realize this future that we're starting to sketch out, versus maybe your expectations given, historical kind of involvement, especially if it does feel like this is the future we're heading towards. Certain governments globally, certain countries may not be as excited about the idea of, individual empowerment to this degree, but at the same time, maybe they don't have an ability to stop it. Like, especially as some of the axes of power form, like East-West versus individual versus, larger government organizations. How do you think this all plays out? And what are things that the open source, decentralized AI community can do preemptively to ensure that the vision we think should happen will happen?
But the libertarian in me says, stay out of the way, let the market, play out. But more practically, I think there are forces in nature that is trying to really intervene. OpenAI of the world have massive, budgets to go after politicians to write regulations or legislations that favor closed AI, right? Really, I think if the state remains, keeps where it is and not get involved, like they only make things better or worse, but eventually through that action, things get better, like what we saw with DeepSeek, right? Just because the government intervened and placed export controls on the chips, people have figured out, right? So there's no stopping of this technology. This is unstoppable. So the only thing is who is going to retain the leadership, which country? If it has to be United States, it has to move out of people's way. That's really what we ask for, I think. And remove all the export controls. I mean, create a truly free market. Let people, like, if we didn't have export controls, DeepSeek wouldn't exist. So in a way, it's a good thing DeepSeek is here, but also like, don't you want Chinese to depend on American technology, and don't you want American dominance in China over Chinese AI? So that's really the question.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think ultimately, like even with this case, almost like I think it didn't even help US policy to do export control, to be honest. And I think maybe on a counter, like I think the current like US policy like points in this direction is that like if you don't embrace AGI basically talent, if you don't embrace the compute to be like unencumbered in your land, then it will move elsewhere, right? And like Europe is seeing this, and obviously it never had like a strong lead in it or like a strong AI ecosystem, like anyway. But like it sure enough, like now has even less of a chance to have it. So I think every country will realize that ultimately, like they can win or like they can enter the race, right? Like to like build sovereign AI, like support even the data center build out in all of their nations. So I think basically from a policy perspective, I think the nations that are embracing like AI, that are embracing like onshoring more and more compute, right, like onto their in their country, will be the countries that do better in the intelligence age than the ones that like say no to it and try to regulate it, right? And I think I've talked with like famous AI founders, right, like that saw the regulations in Europe and immediately considered moving to the UK or to the US. And I think it just shows you that like the builders, like the talent, the capital, the compute, like would just move elsewhere, right? Like if specific like governments and policies like regulated in the wrong way. But I think on the other side, like I don't think like there's that many cases where like strong regulatory interventions in a similar way in technology like really helped. So I think it has second and third order consequences that even if well intentioned, usually achieve the exact opposite of what they intend to. So I think a lot of the AI policy would have been better off like not doing anything, and kind of like the outcomes and the consequences of their actions were kind of even counter to what they intended to achieve. So I think that's also like I echo also Greg's take in this direction.
Yeah, state intervention goes wrong almost all the time. If you look at like the original state intervention in America when we had the railroads post Cold War, so post Civil War, right? So railroads were growing organically, but the government intervened and started awarding these railroad companies land, and these companies became real estate companies, and then regulation came to regulate those companies. we wouldn't have regulation if the government did not intervene. So I think government should not intervene in a free market, even by supporting it by giving subsidies, because subsidies almost always get misused. Tariffs almost always get misused, right? So tariffs and subsidies are terrible for a free market. So the state should stay out of the way, and not not even the 500 the big investment plans people are making is not the way to do it, right? Now, I think that's just going to backfire. If you ask me, I mean, it's counterintuitive, but I think it's going to backfire.
Right. Well, guys, thank you so much. So much Web3 AI insights packed into one call. Greg and Vincent, thank you for joining us. We really enjoyed having you on the show. That was Akash Network founder Greg Osuri and Prime Intellect co-founder Vincent Weisser. For those of you who tuned in, thank you so much for listening. Let's keep the conversation going. Leave us a review. Let us know what you thought. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, my handle is at JBRUKH, JBrook, and Evans is at Evan the Feng, EVANTHEFENG. Make sure you download where you get your podcasts. We'll be back soon to dig deep on ideas of the blockchain space. Thank you so much. See you next time.